Hello everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of my new show titled Contemporary or Classic. I'm your host, Eric Monahan. Now before we begin, I would like to provide you guys with a brief introduction of why I decided to create this podcast. To answer directly, I absolutely love films. I've held a keen interest in movies ever since I was a child, shoving VHS tapes of my parents' movies that I probably should not have been watching as a 5-year-old into my VCR. I would sneak movies of all different types of genres, but mostly horror movies on TV while my parents weren't in the room. From Jaws and all of its sequels to other slasher horror movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th, I was always watching movies. Now, because of my lengthy history with movies and the impact they've had on my life, I figured that they would be a very solid basis for my podcast to discuss them in very good detail. As for what separates my show from others of similar content, I will be discussing the similarities and differences of two films of the same caliber from two different time periods. For example, I may take two films within the Western genre, one from the 60s in the same vein as classic Sergio Leone films like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and other more recent Western films such as S. Craig Zahler's Bone Tomahawk with Kurt Russell. And now that I've chosen two films and established them as the classic and the contemporary for this hypothetical episode, I would dissect the two films and point out all the comparisons and contrasts of each, and basically which of the categories I prefer between each film. Since I'd be talking about Western movies, themes of heroism, individualism, justice, and masculinity would most likely be discussed as similarities of old and new Western films, while violence and score and soundtrack would probably be discussed as differences. Now that you guys have a decent look at how this show will operate, please join me as I talk about one of my all-time favorite movies, John Carpenter's The Thing. In 1982, John Carpenter, the writer-director of Halloween, Escape from New York, and They Live, brought to the screen a modern take of what he considers to be one of his favorite films, The Thing from Another World. Directed by Christian Nyby and produced and written by Howard Hawks in 1951, this science fiction classic depicts a United States Air Force in Antarctica who discover an alien creature within a frozen spacecraft. Soon, the aliens begin attacking the crew. Before I discuss the 1951 film in more depth, I should probably make note of an even earlier example of this story. When John Carpenter decided to adapt this film, he also looked to the original source material, which was a novella written by John W. Campbell in 1938, which was called Who Goes There? This novella, while a short piece of writing, explores both sides of thematic horror. Now, what I mean by this is that it is common for horror content to depict either a sense of courageousness and heroic triumph against evil, or a sense of defeat. Basically, the stories will either end with beating the bad guy or losing to the bad guy. This leads us to our first drastic difference: themes and the characters that fuel them. In The Thing from Another World, the majority of the characters are members of a branch of the United States Air Force known as the Alaskan Air Command. Other characters are primarily doctors and Nobel laureates who are conducting research within the compound. Right off the bat, we are meant to view these men as very respectable doctors and powerful authority figures who are partaking in very important scientific works. While the medical and academic research aspect is widely regarded, even for today's standards, as very admirable and respectable positions, the aspect of military officers portrayed as heroic figures would most likely be disputed today. It is important to view this through the lens of a 1951 audience as opposed to a 2023 audience. The film was released just 6 years after World War II. The United States military was overwhelmingly celebrated by the general public. Imperialism was at its height. We had just defeated the Nazis. Basically, if there was any time in American history to portray the military as heroic and strong, now was the time. Now, because of this, themes of triumph and perseverance are extremely blatant throughout the post-war film in 1951. In 1982, on the other hand, most of the characters are either molecular biologists or physical scientists, with some blue-collar men scattered throughout there. For example, you had the cook, you had mechanics, you had helicopter pilots, you had dog sled instructors. There were a bunch of other characters that weren't simply Army Rangers or police officers or doctors. But there is one ex-military officer in the 1982 film named Gary, and he is meant to be seen as a bit of a lousy cop and a pushover. He's kind of a slouch. By this point in history, the United States had been out of the Vietnam War for about 7-ish years, and our country had seen just about every single form of protest and demonstration against authority and military action. So needless to say, the general public were now much more prone to viewing the police and military figures as flawed or corrupt. It is certainly possible that John Carpenter wanted to depict this in a much more subtle way to avoid a rather tone-deaf idolization of authority figures that would have been much more welcome in the early 50s as opposed to the early 80s. But outside of that, there aren't too many overt differences between individual characters of each film other than simple name changes or, other attributes that may have shown them as much more vulnerable within the 1982 version. I will detail the vulnerability in a little bit. Now, staying in the realm of theme, the next comparison I would want to make is theme and tone. As I talked about this before, the original film portrays heavy themes of valor and courage, which ultimately caused the film to feel much more old school science fiction based, less than genuine horror based. On the other hand, the 1982 version delivers a much more bleak, disturbing, and agnostic portrayal of the story. The 1982 version does a much better job of humanizing the characters as opposed to the original, who serve as borderline absurdly brave men who combat the alien creature. Whereas the 1982 version, these men are scared. These men are extremely scared. There is a brilliantly deep sense of anxiety looming over the entire film. This is easily attributed to a pretty major change in the storylines of the film. In the original, the alien always shows itself in its true form. It's giant, it's scary, it looks like a big man in a big costume. In John Carpenter's remake, the alien is an organism that can perfectly replicate any living being with no blemish or tell. It is virtually impossible to tell who is human and who isn't, and many characters end up being assimilated by the thing. Not only do I feel that this change is significantly better in the creative sense, but I also feel that it is better for the tone of the film. It truly heightens the paranoia of the men stranded on this snowy compound with the horrifying realization that there is an invisible organism with the power to assimilate anyone it comes in contact with. It is somewhere among them. They have no idea who or what it is, and they are extremely scared. The sequences of distrust and turmoil this causes within the remake is, in my opinion, an exemplary case of phenomenal screenwriting by Bill Lancaster, who was also the credited screenwriter for early drafts of the movie Firestarter, which is based off the Stephen King novel of the same name. So when it comes to theme and tone, I am giving the victory to John Carpenter's 1982 version. It dominates this category so much that I would go as far as to say that it is one of the best on-screen depictions of anxiety and distrust between characters, which truly complements the horror element of the film so perfectly, in my opinion. Continuing on, the next category will be score and soundtrack. Now, for the 1951 version, there isn't terribly too much to talk about. A lot of the score is very much the same as any other monster movie from the 50s. There are a lot of horns, a lot of brass section. It's extremely theatrical and over-exaggerated. It is not one of my favorite soundtracks, even though it does complement the film pretty well in terms of presentation and overall how it sounds. It sounds nice and everything, but it's just not one of my favorites. But as for the 1982 version, the score was composed and conducted by Ennio Morricone. Now, I am mentioning this. I would like to add that Ennio Morricone had actually scored the older Sergio Leone films that I had mentioned in the intro of the show. If you heard his piece for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly titled Ecstasy of Gold, you would undoubtedly have heard this before. It has been used and sampled in so many different forms of media. It's been in movies, it's been in shows, it's been in songs. It is virtually uncountable by this point how many times I've heard it in different forms of media, but I digress. The introductory piece that accompanies the opening credits is an absolutely perfect fit for setting the mood of what we are about to witness. The film's credits display very simple fade-in, fade-out, white text over black background, but there's a very subtle yet defined and ominous synth sound, which was very standard for the early 1980s. As the credits and score come out to a close, we see a dim sky, which is supposed to be outer space, which is endlessly sprawled with stars. Suddenly, we see a flying saucer is hurtling to Earth, followed by this deafening silence. It's extremely unsettling. It may be my favorite example of a score accompanying opening credits. It feels like the most perfect puzzle piece. After the opening sequence, the memorable score kicks in. Those who have seen the film even just once will recognize the unique and simple score. It's a score that feels inherently dooming. I would even go as far as to compare this tune to the very iconic theme from Jaws, as they are both very simple in nature. They're both 2 notes, roughly, but they are extremely memorable and effective. This piece both opens and closes the film, delivering what I believe to be an extremely perfect sense of dread for each half of the film. While I will get to discussing the end of the film, I must add that the score is a perfect addition to the ending of the film. Concluding the score and soundtrack section, I would also like to note that the music does complement both films in their respective tone. Even if it seemed like I wasn't the biggest fan of the 1951 version, it still suits the film very well. Although it does have a much more operatic and theatrical film score to, kind of match the feeling of valiance and action. The 1982 version sees a much more reserved and eerie score to match the disturbing aura of the film. So for that, I will be giving this one to the 1982 version. The next section I would like to dissect is the ending to both films. I'm going to go right off the bat and say that the 1982 version is significantly better. It is much scarier. In the 1951 version, there is a very standard 1950s American wet dream type example of an ending where, of course, we are victors against the thing. They defeat it. The movie ends on a very happy note. Where in the 1982 version, there is way more uncertainty. There are 2 characters left, and one of them is the thing, and they don't know who it is, and we as the audience never find out, and it is horrifying. The final conversation between these 2 characters is extremely memorable. Neither of them trust each other still. They know they're going to end up dying out there, whether one is the thing or the other. They have no idea. It is one of the bleakest, uncertain, and horrifying endings to a film I've ever seen, and I absolutely love it. The final comparison I will be making between the 2 films are special effects, and how could I not? John Carpenter's version is still widely regarded to this day as having some of the best practical gore effects in the history of film, let alone horror films or monster films. If this wasn't a spoiler for my ultimate choice of special effects, then I really have no idea what is. But before I go on and on about how unbelievable and fantastic the special effects are within the remake, I really want to give some credit to the original and the amazing fire stunt performed in it. This stunt is impressive for today's standards, let alone 1951. So I really want to commend the stunt crew for such a phenomenal job with the safety and special effects resources for the early 1950s. Now, let's talk about the 1982 effects.
Clear!
Clear.
The man behind the effects was a 23-year-old named Rob Bottin, who did unbelievable work on the entire film by himself. Every appearance of the alien creature in its own element within the film is an extraordinarily unique and wildly violent creation. The scenes of alien assimilation upon the humans are super sick and gruesome in the most fun way possible. While it may be unfair to compare the special effects of two films within such drastically different time periods where there are significantly less resources to complete such effects, I don't care. The 1982 version knocks it out of the park. It is literally no contest, and this podcast is a compare and contrast based podcast, so obviously I will be giving it to the 1982 version. Overall, John Carpenter's The Thing is a masterpiece, and while the original is not without its celebration and recognition, especially for its time, it is just simply inferior to the 1982 version. I would recommend this version to anyone and everyone, regardless of their enjoyment of horror films. This is a movie that is an absolute treat to watch people react to. I'm talking jaws on the floor at the unreal special effects and violence that don't overstay their welcome and aid in the progression of the story, which is a massive plus in my opinion. It is gratuitous in all of the acceptable ways and complements the horror of the situation perfectly, while treating us to the height of 80s practical effects. The 1982 version sweeps every category. Well, that is all for this episode. Please join me next time as I discuss the differences and similarities between Michael Mann's Manhunter and Brett Ratner's Red Dragon. I'm Eric Monahan, and this has been Contemporary or Classic.